The world I once trusted slipped away slowly, piece by piece, until the faces I depended on became the very shadows that haunted me. What unfolded inside those walls was not a sudden blow, but a quiet erosion, a breaking that left me carrying grief heavier than the accident that nearly took my life. Behind the smiles, I came home to were words that cut deeper than steel, words that still echo in the dark corners of my memory. This story is not only about survival, but about the cruelty that wears the mask of care and the moment when truth shatters the illusion of love. Stay close as I unravel it for you. Give this video a like, subscribe if you want more, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from and which part of these opening lines pulls at you most. At first, I thought I could endure it, that perhaps I could learn to adapt to a life without hearing. But as the days stretched into weeks, despair crept into me like a slow fog. I remembered Helen, my late wife, and how she used to remind me that everything in life happens for a reason, that even pain can lead to purpose. Yet lying there in silence, I doubted her wisdom, doubted my own faith in the rhythm of life. Then, one morning, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling tiles, the world shifted. The first sound was faint, almost too faint to be real, a steady pulse that grew stronger with each second, the beeping of the heart monitor at my bedside. I froze, afraid to move, afraid it was an illusion. But the sound continued, steady and real, beating with the same rhythm as the thud inside my chest. My heart and the machine sang together. And for me, it was the most beautiful symphony I had ever heard. My breath caught as tears welled in my eyes, and my hands trembled so much that I had to clutch the sheets just to ground myself. Dr. Lowell appeared, his lips moving as they had so many times before, but this time his voice reached me clear as day. "Mr. Kane, can you hear me now?" The sound of his words, so ordinary yet so extraordinary, broke me open. I nodded quickly, almost frantically, afraid that if I spoke the miracle would collapse like a fragile bubble. But then I let the words escape my throat. "It's all back. Everything." My own voice startled me, strange yet familiar, like hearing a long-lost friend. "Dr." Lowell smiled, jotting notes on his clipboard, the scratch of his pen against paper another sound I had thought lost forever. He told me the inflammation had subsided, that my hearing was testing normal again, that I was whole. I could not stop listening. Every shuffle of his shoes, every click of the pen, every breath I drew felt like a gift returned. Nurse Carver came in to explain my discharge process, his deep voice filling the room with authority, but my attention was everywhere at once. The rattle of the cart in the hallway, the laughter of staff in the distance, the ding of the elevator down the corridor. The hospital was alive in ways I had forgotten. As I signed the papers, the scratch of the pen sounded like music. I whispered, "Thank you," to both of them, the sound of my gratitude carrying farther than I expected. Walking toward the elevator, my shoes echoed against the walls, and I nearly laughed out loud at the simple wonder of hearing myself walk. The doors opened with a chime, and I rode down to the parking garage with my heart hammering in rhythm with the hum of the elevator. My Honda Civic waited where Eldon had parked it 3 weeks earlier, a loyal companion untouched by time. When I started the engine, the rumble nearly made me weep. The radio clicked on to a classic rock station Helen had loved, and hearing those familiar chords was like having her beside me for a fleeting second. "Everything happens for a reason," I whispered, repeating her old mantra, and for the first time in weeks, I wanted to believe it again. The drive home was a blur of rediscovered sound, the rush of traffic around me, the squeal of brakes, the sharp honk of impatient horns, the whoosh of air through the vents. Even the noise of the world, the clatter and chaos, felt alive and precious. When I turned onto my street, I heard the distant bark of a dog answered by another, the high-pitched laughter of children playing tag in a yard 2 houses down, the scrape of a rake as Mr. Whitaker tended to his garden. My legs stiffened as if I had been struck by lightning, my ears refusing to believe what they had just delivered. But there was no mistake, no misinterpretation, no gentle kindness hidden between the syllables. My son, the boy I had raised, the young man I had sacrificed decades of work for, was calling me a burden. Marjorie's voice followed, smooth and cutting, filled with the cold practicality of someone who saw lives only as numbers on a ledger. At least the insurance money covered his medical bills. Could have been worse. Their laughter, sharp and mocking, rang in my restored ears like a punishment for daring to hope. I pressed my back against the wall, breathing shallow, my heart pounding so loudly I feared they might hear me. For 3 weeks, I had imagined Eldon's patience, his scribbled notes, his small gestures of care as proof of his devotion. Yet now, in an instant, those illusions shattered, leaving me standing in the doorway of my own home as nothing more than an unwanted responsibility in their eyes. I told myself it might be a misunderstanding, that my still adjusting ears had twisted the words, but then Eldon's voice returned, heavier and colder, hammering nails into my denial. I just want this whole thing over with. 3 weeks of pretending to care about his every need. I'm exhausted, my breath caught, and the hallway around me seemed to tilt, the walls bending as though the house itself recoiled at his confession. The boy I had sent through college, the man I had supported through the darkest valleys of his life, was complaining that 3 weeks of living under my roof, 3 weeks of offering the smallest measure of care, had been too much. I wanted to shout, to storm into the kitchen and demand an explanation, but my instincts told me to stay silent, to listen, to let their words condemn them. The conversation deepened like a pit, and I found myself sinking further with each passing second. Sunset Manor has good reviews, Marjorie said, her tone laced with satisfaction, like a predator circling its prey. It's not too expensive, and the settlement money should cover the deposit. I gripped the wall so tightly my knuckles burned, my nails scraping against the paint, fighting to keep my body upright. My son responded with eagerness, his voice tinged with greed. Once he's out of here, we can start renovating. Knock out the wall between the dining room and the living room. Realtor said that'll add at least 50 grand in value. Maybe redo the kitchen too. The air left my lungs as though I had been punched. My home, the place where Helen and I had built our lives, where we raised our children and weathered storms together, was being discussed like merchandise, a property to flip for profit, a commodity to squeeze until nothing of me remained. I slid 1 foot silently against the hallway floor, moving closer to the kitchen doorway, my ears straining through the vent that carried their voices so clearly. I could not stop listening even though every word was another knife twisting deeper. Eldon asked quietly, "Do you think he suspects anything?" Marjorie laughed, a cruel, mocking laugh that stabbed me deeper than any insult. "Are you kidding? He can't hear a thing. The poor old man just nods and smiles while I write notes." Pathetic. Her voice dripped with contempt, with the arrogance of someone who believed the stage she was performing on was safe from discovery. I inhaled slowly, steadied my breathing, and forced myself to step into the performance of a lifetime. I walked into the kitchen with deliberate heaviness in my steps, dragging my shoes slightly so it seemed like I was uncertain and weak. Eldon and Marjorie looked up, and the transformation on their faces was instant. Just moments ago, their voices had been dripping with contempt, but now they were masks of tenderness, concern, and dutiful affection. Eldon leapt up, his voice pitched in artificial cheer. "Dad, you look tired. Let me help you." He grasped my arm lightly, as if I were fragile crystal about to shatter. Marjorie, quick on the act, reached for the notepad she had used so faithfully these past weeks. Her pen scrawled the familiar message. Doctor says your hearing might return soon. That's wonderful news. She smiled, wide and bright, her eyes eager to gauge my reaction. I let my face soften, let a flicker of hope play across it as if I truly believed her. I nodded, then pointed to my ears and shrugged, feigning confusion and helpless gratitude. Inside, I was sickened, watching their eyes sparkle with false concern, knowing they had just moments earlier discussed selling the house where Helen and I had built our entire life together. I leaned on the table, deliberately moving slower, letting my shoulders sag with fatigue so they could see what they wanted to see, an old man barely holding himself together. Marjorie scribbled again. Do you want something to eat? I smiled faintly, waved my hand, and sat down heavily at the chair. Eldon hovered near me, raising his voice unnecessarily as if speaking louder would suddenly make me understand. We'll take good care of you, Dad. Don't you worry. His hand patted my shoulder, the same hand that just hours earlier had gestured in excitement at the prospect of tearing down my dining room wall for profit. I studied his face, memorizing the precise tilt of his smile, the way his brows creased just enough to look sincere. I memorized Marjorie's posture, the tilt of her head that mimicked sympathy but failed to hide the greed simmering beneath. Every detail mattered, because when the time came to confront them, I wanted to remember exactly how skilled they were at their performance. I scribbled my own message on the pad, writing slowly so my shaky script matched the illusion of fragility. Tired, going upstairs to rest, I handed it to Marjorie, and her face brightened with practiced sweetness. Of course, Dad. Rest as much as you need. Her voice was syrupy, warm enough to fool anyone who had not overheard her cold calculations about insurance money. Eldon leaned close, squeezing my hand, murmuring words of false comfort. I let my eyes look wet, let a faint smile curl across my lips, and nodded again. I rose slowly, gripping the banister as though I needed it desperately, each step heavy and deliberate. Yet inside I was alive with fire, my heart beating hard not from weakness, but from the rage and resolve surging through me. As I climbed, I heard Eldon's voice drop to a whisper. See? He doesn't suspect anything. He's buying it. Marjorie chuckled, low and cruel, completely clueless, just the way we need him. I kept climbing, my face carefully blank, but every step upward felt like forging a blade. In my room, I closed the door quietly and let my body sag onto the bed. My mind replayed every gesture, every word, the way Marjorie widened her eyes in my written note, the way Eldon squeezed my shoulder. They were actors in a play they thought I could not hear, but I was the audience who saw through every lie. I needed to hear more, needed to understand exactly how far their betrayal reached. The house that Helen and I had built decades ago had perfect acoustics, and the vents carried voices as if they were designed to deliver confessions straight into my ears. I crept back to the landing, positioning myself on the spot I knew avoided the groaning step, crouching close to the vent where the sounds of the kitchen below rose like poisoned smoke. Their words were clearer than I expected. Marjorie's voice floated upward, calm and calculating. Sunset Manor charges $4,800 a month, but Medicare covers most if we frame it right. We only need the right paperwork. I pressed my forehead against the wall, while rising in my throat at how easily she spoke of selling my life into confinement. Eldon's response came eager and greedy, the voice of a man who saw his father not as flesh and blood, but as an obstacle. The realtor said this place could fetch $470, maybe more if we renovate before listing. After paying off the mortgage, we'll have $320 left for the down payment and Whitefish. That's our future. I shut my eyes tightly as their vision of tomorrow became clearer. My house sold, my savings drained, my independence stolen. Also, they could start fresh somewhere else while I rotted in a sterile room. Marjorie continued, her words cutting sharper than any blade. We need to establish a pattern first. A few notes about forgetfulness, confusion, maybe wandering at night. Dr. Keene will sign off. She owes me from the Camaro deal. She'll say he's not competent, and the rest will be simple. My knuckles whitened on the banister, the rage inside me threatening to erupt. They were not only conspiring to discard me, they were planning to forge lies about my mind, my memory, my identity, turning me into a shadow of myself on paper so they could gain control. Eldon chuckled, a dark, humorless sound. Once he's declared unfit, no one will question us. We'll have control over the accounts, the property, everything. He won't even see it coming. I clenched my jaw and steadied my breath, refusing to make a sound that might alert them. The irony was bitter, because they thought they were clever enough to trick me with fake diagnoses and paperwork, when the truth was that I had already heard every word, every laugh, every whisper. They thought the deaf old man upstairs was harmless, unaware, waiting passively for whatever fate they chose. They had no idea that he had already risen from the grave they were digging. I backed away from the vent, each step deliberate and silent, until I reached the safety of my bedroom again. Sitting in the stillness, I realized that anger was not enough. If I was to defeat them, I needed patience, cunning, and evidence. The performance of frailty would become my weapon. I paced the room, replaying their dialogue again and again in my mind until it was etched as deeply as scripture. The numbers, the names, the scheme, they had all betrayed themselves by speaking freely. Helen's voice came back to me, that steady warning she had often repeated when Eldon was younger and demanding more than we could afford. You give too much, Luther. He doesn't know the meaning of gratitude. I had dismissed her then, believing that generosity was the bond that held family together. But now, as I listened to the echoes of my son plotting my erasure, I knew she had been right all along. He had never learned gratitude. He had only learned to take until there was nothing left. So I rose from the bed quietly, careful not to alert them to my wakefulness, and I walked down the hall to the study where the filing cabinet still stood exactly where Helen and I had placed it years ago. The metal was cool under my hand, and as I slid the drawer open, the scent of old paper and ink filled my nose, carrying with it decades of memory. The first folder I pulled free held receipts from Eldon's wedding. Nearly $35,000 I had withdrawn from my retirement savings because my son insisted his bride deserved the very best. I remembered the day clearly. Eldon in his tuxedo, Helen glowing with pride, and me smiling though my stomach churned at the thought of the future I had cashed away for the occasion. I had told myself that it was worth it, that a father's job was to give without counting the cost, that one day Eldon would understand what I had done for him and repay it with gratitude. The next folder contained the student loan payments, $28,000 in checks written out across the years to keep him from drowning in debt. I saw again the tearful young man in my kitchen, his hands shaking as he said he could not finish school, that the debt would break him, and I had written the checks without hesitation, promising him that education was too important to sacrifice. I remembered Helen's quiet voice after he left, telling me that perhaps I was teaching him to lean too heavily on me, that maybe he needed to stand on his own 2 feet. I had silenced her with the stubborn conviction that helping my son was always the right choice. And now, as I stared at those canceled checks, I felt the bitter truth settle into me that I had not helped him grow. I had taught him to expect. I flipped further back and found the documents for the down payment on his first apartment, $15,000 more, scraped together from savings I had built with extra hours and overtime. Helen had asked me then whether Eldon would ever learn to manage on his own if I kept cushioning him from every fall, but I had argued that family was about stepping in when someone stumbled. My heart had believed it, but my head should have seen the pattern. He never stood up straighter because I lifted him. He only leaned harder the next time. Then came the folder that hurt the most, the thick stack of hospital bills from Helen's final months. $67,000 not covered by insurance. Bills I had carried alone while Eldon made excuses for why he could not visit. I remembered sitting beside her bed in the hospice, holding her hand as she whispered her worry for him, asking why he was not there, and me lying gently, telling her he would come tomorrow, that he was just busy because I wanted her last days to be free of disappointment. He had not been busy with anything that mattered. He simply did not want to face her fading body, and now I realized that absence had been the truest sign of what was to come. I kept my expression blank during breakfast, chewing slowly on toast that tasted like ash, while Eldon paced the kitchen on the phone and Marjorie sat smugly at the table, scribbling something into a ledger I had not seen before. When Eldon hung up, he casually announced that a realtor would be visiting soon to evaluate the property. My jaw tightened, but I nodded as if indifferent, because revealing my fury too early would only give them more reason to accelerate their scheme. What they did not know was that I had already made an appointment of my own, quietly arranging to meet Sylvia Trent, an attorney Helen had trusted in the past. I spent the afternoon in the study again, this time not dwelling on the past, but preparing for the future, collecting documents that prove my ownership of the house, the clean title, the deed signed in my name alone, and the bank accounts showing the mortgage had been paid off years earlier. Each page I stacked into a neat folder gave me a little more strength. But I also knew Eldon and Marjorie would not hesitate to use deception if necessary, and I feared they already had something in motion. That fear became real 2 days later when I received a letter addressed to me, supposedly from my doctor, Dr. Lowell. It claimed that due to my fragile condition, I had been declared unfit to manage my own affairs, and that a petition for guardianship had been filed. The signature looked like Dr. Lowell's, but my instinct screamed it was a forgery. My hands shook as I folded the letter back into its envelope, the bitter confirmation that they were not just planning to steal, but already laying the legal foundation to erase me. That night, I tested Eldon with careful words, asking him if he had spoken to Dr. Lowell recently. His eyes flickered just long enough to betray the lie before he said, too quickly, that yes, Dr. Lowell had expressed concern about my memory lapses. I pressed no further, pretending to accept his excuse, but inside I raged at how easily he was willing to twist the truth, even invent false weakness in me, to justify stripping me of control. Marjorie added to the cruelty by smiling sweetly and asking if I remembered where I'd left my keys that morning, a deliberate jab meant to paint me as forgetful. I answered calmly, telling her they were in my coat pocket, and the slight narrowing of her eyes told me she realized her tactic had failed. I did not sleep that night. Instead, I wrote down every detail of what had happened since my recovery, from the overheard conversation about selling the house to the sudden appearance of forged medical claims, and I stored these notes along with the folders of financial sacrifice in a locked box. If anything happened to me, I wanted there to be no doubt about what Eldon and Marjorie were doing. I also made copies of the deeds and my will, which left the house to Darla, the only child who had never asked for a cent she did not earn. With every precaution, I felt the noose of their scheme tightening, but also my resolve hardening. The next morning, the realtor came as promised, a brisk woman named Mrs. Keaton who shook my hand firmly, but glanced at Eldon for approval before speaking to me. It was clear she believed he was in charge. I made sure to walk her through every room myself, my steps steady, my voice strong, correcting Eldon whenever he tried to answer in my place. By the time she left, she seemed uncertain, her eyes flicking between us, as though she was beginning to question whether I was really the frail man Eldon had described. I held on to that small victory as I shut the door behind her, though I knew Eldon would not take it lightly. True enough, later that evening he cornered me in the hallway, his voice low and sharp, accusing me of undermining him. He said I was making things difficult for everyone, that my resistance was only dragging out the inevitable. I stared straight into his eyes and reminded him quietly that the house was mine, bought and paid for with my labor, and that nothing he did could erase that fact. His jaw clenched, and for a moment I thought he might strike me, but instead he turned on his heel and stormed off. Marjorie's laughter drifted from the living room, thin and mocking, as if she had been listening the whole time. The pressure grew unbearable as days passed. I caught Nurse Carver, the aide Eldon had insisted on hiring, rifling through my desk drawers under the pretense of tidying. When I demanded to know what he was doing, he muttered something about organizing paperwork and left quickly, but I was not fooled. Eldon and Marjorie were using him as their eyes and ears, perhaps even their hands, in their plot to gather information and fabricate evidence of my supposed incapacity. I responded by moving my most important documents to a hidden compartment under the floorboards of the study, a secret Helen and I had built decades ago when we feared burglars after a rash of break-ins in the neighborhood. Now it served me again, protecting the truth from my own blood. The final straw came when Darla visited unexpectedly. She had grown suspicious of Eldon's distance and wanted to see me for herself. I could see the worry in her eyes when she hugged me, searching my face for signs of frailty. But instead of telling her the full truth, I kept my words measured, careful not to endanger her. Still, she noticed the tension immediately, and when Eldon tried to dominate the conversation, she cut him off sharply, demanding to know why he was speaking for me. The fire in her voice reminded me so much of Helen that I nearly wept. Eldon tried to dismiss her concerns, but Darla's gaze lingered on me, silently promising that she knew something was wrong. That moment gave me strength, for I realized I was not entirely alone in this fight. Eldon and Marjorie had spent weeks weaving their web, and now, with Darla's suspicion threatening to unravel it, I knew they would strike harder, faster, and with less caution. When morning came, I found a new letter slipped beneath my bedroom door. This one bore the seal of the county clerk's office and claimed that a court hearing had been scheduled to review my competency. The petitioners were Eldon and Marjorie. My name was written as respondent. My chest tightened as I read the words, knowing they had escalated to the point of no return. They were no longer simply scheming behind my back. They were attempting to strip me of my very voice. I carried the letter into the study and read it again under the dim light of the desk lamp, my hands trembling, but my mind sharpening. They thought they had trapped me, but what they did not know was that I had already contacted Sylvia Trent and had given her the copies of my deeds and medical records. Still, I understood this battle was no longer about documents alone. It was about perception, about who the court would believe. Eldon was betting on painting me as a feeble old man, and Marjorie would no doubt parade her false compassion as evidence of my decline. I needed more than papers. I needed witnesses, proof of their deceit, undeniable evidence that would expose them before they succeeded. That evening, I watched Eldon more carefully than ever. His temper had become shorter, his words clipped and edged with frustration, while Marjorie grew bolder, openly mocking me by reminding me to take pills I did not need, or asking if I remembered what day it was. They were rehearsing their roles, preparing for court, building the narrative that I was slipping into confusion. I decided to test them, playing into their expectations. At dinner, I let my fork fall to the floor and asked Marjorie to remind me what meal we were having. Her eyes lit with cruel satisfaction as she explained slowly, as if to a child, that it was meatloaf. Eldon smirked and shook his head, muttering something about how hard it had become to watch me struggle. I forced myself not to explode, not to show that I knew exactly what they were doing, because in that moment I was no longer just surviving their abuse. I was documenting it in my mind, preparing to reveal it. 2 days later, I found my opportunity. Nurse Carver returned under the pretense of checking my blood pressure, but while I sat quietly, I noticed the corner of one of my personal letters peeking out of his pocket. I recognized it immediately as one of the notes I had written and hidden in my desk weeks ago. He had been stealing from me, feeding Eldon and Marjorie the words I had written to protect myself. I asked him for a glass of water, and while he stepped into the kitchen, I reached into his bag and found a small recorder hidden beneath his supplies. My heart pounded as I realized he had been taping our conversations, likely waiting for moments when I seemed weak or forgetful. I slipped the recorder back into place before he returned, but I knew then that I had to act. That night, under the cover of darkness, I retrieved the locked box from beneath the floorboards and placed it in a duffel bag with some clothes. I called Darla and asked her to meet me at a diner on the edge of town. When she arrived, her face pale with worry, I told her everything. I showed her the forged letter, described the realtor's visit, and explained how Nurse Carver had been recording me. Darla's jaw tightened as she listened, fury flashing in her eyes. She promised she would stand beside me in court and testify to my clarity of mind. But more than that, she urged me to stop playing defense. She wanted me to take the fight directly to them. Her words lit something inside me, a fire that had been waiting too long to ignite. The next morning, I returned home with renewed purpose. Eldon was waiting, his arms crossed, his expression smug. He asked where I had been, his tone sharp with suspicion. I answered calmly that I had been out, enjoying the day, and that he had no authority to question me. His face darkened, and he told me that soon he would be responsible for all my decisions, that I should prepare myself for change. I let him have his fantasy because I knew what was coming. That afternoon, I called Sylvia and told her everything Darla and I had discovered, including Nurse Carver's theft and the forged letter. Sylvia assured me she would subpoena both the doctor and the realtor, and that we would not only fight their petition, but expose their fraud in the process. Days passed with unbearable tension. Every interaction in the house a test of endurance. Marjorie taunted me relentlessly, once even taking the keys to my car and hiding them, claiming she was protecting me from driving in my condition. I pretended not to notice when she returned them a day later, the cruel grin on her face revealing how much joy she took in these petty abuses. Eldon, meanwhile, spent hours on the phone, his voice hushed but urgent, and I knew he was preparing his case, building his false image of me. What they did not realize was that every cruel act, every slip of arrogance, was ammunition for me. The day before the court hearing, Darla visited again, this time in front of Eldon and Marjorie. She greeted me warmly, asked clear questions about the books on my shelf, and let me answer in detail, her subtle way of proving to them, and perhaps to herself, that my mind was sharp. When Eldon tried to interrupt, she cut him off once more, telling him that she would be present in court and that she would not remain silent about what she had witnessed. The fury in Eldon's eyes nearly boiled over, but he restrained himself, perhaps remembering the realtor's uncertain gaze, perhaps fearing that his mask might slip too soon. When Darla arrived to drive me to the courthouse, I saw in her eyes the determination of someone who knew justice had to be fought for, not simply wished upon. The drive was silent but charged, the town sliding by in a blur as the courthouse came into view, its steps crowded with strangers, reporters, and the curious who had come to witness the scandal of the family tearing itself apart. Inside, the air was thick with whispers and judgmental stares. Eldon and Marjorie sat on the opposite bench, dressed impeccably as if for a celebration, their faces painted with false sorrow. Eldon leaned close to Marjorie and muttered something that made her lips curl into a cruel smile. I did not flinch. I gripped Darla's hand briefly, drawing strength from her presence, and then sat tall, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing me small. The judge entered, stern and deliberate, and the gavel fell with a sound that echoed like a hammer striking steel. The case was called, and suddenly my entire life was on trial. Eldon's attorney rose first, painting a portrait of me as a man lost in confusion, a burden on those who loved him. He described incidents, some exaggerated, some invented, about my supposed forgetfulness, my supposed inability to manage basic tasks. He called Marjorie to the stand, and she performed her role with theatrical precision, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief as she described how worried she had been, how she had sacrificed so much to care for me, how she feared for my safety if I were left alone. I watched her weave her lies with skill, twisting every moment into a narrative of decline. Each word struck like a blow, but I kept my composure, waiting for my chance. Then Nurse Carver was called. He spoke with professional calm, citing his supposed medical concerns, repeating phrases I now knew were recorded from his hidden device. He claimed I often repeated myself, asked the same questions, misplaced important items. He presented his notes as fact, and for a moment I saw the judge's brow furrow, as though doubt had begun to seep into the cracks of truth. My pulse quickened, but I remembered Darla's words. Do not defend in fear, strike with the truth. When the attorney finished, Sylvia Trent rose with the confidence of someone who carried justice like a shield. She began by introducing the evidence. My recent medical records, signed by Dr. Lowell, stating clearly that my recovery had been complete and my faculties intact. She handed the forged letter from the county clerk's office to the judge, pointing out the inconsistencies in the seal and the signature. Then she called Darla to the stand. My niece's voice rang clear and strong as she testified to my sharpness, to our conversations, to my ability to manage details that contradicted the image Eldon and Marjorie tried to create. The courtroom shifted, the audience murmuring, the judge leaning forward. Sylvia saved her sharpest blow for last. She revealed the realtor's testimony, secured only the day before, stating that Eldon and Marjorie had attempted to pressure him into selling my home behind my back, showing him a deed with my forged signature. Gasps filled the room as the realtor confirmed it under oath, his unease evident, his guilt pushing him to tell the truth. I finally took the stand. The room quieted, all eyes on me, expecting a broken old man, but I sat tall and steady, my voice carrying the weight of lived experience. I spoke of my career, of the years of service and responsibility, of the way I had cared for Eldon when his mother died, raising him with everything I had left. I described the weeks of recovery after the accident, the moment I regained my hearing, the joy of returning to life with clarity. I explained calmly how Marjorie had inserted herself into the household, how Eldon had grown distant and greedy, and how their actions had escalated to deceit, manipulation, and theft. I did not raise my voice. I did not beg for sympathy. I laid out the truth with precision, letting the dignity of it carry weight. When Sylvia asked her final question, whether I believed I could continue to live independently, I looked directly at Eldon and Marjorie before answering. I told the court that my strength had been underestimated, that I had endured more in a lifetime than they could imagine, and that I would not be stripped of my voice by lies. The silence after my words was thicker than any argument, and I saw Eldon's jaw tighten. Marjorie's hand clenched the handkerchief as her performance collapsed. The judge's gavel struck once, calling for order, but the outcome was already shifting like a tide against them. The closing arguments were delivered, Eldon's attorney scrambling to salvage credibility while Sylvia stood calmly, reminding the court of the evidence, the witnesses, and the character that could not be fabricated. When the judge finally spoke, his words were deliberate and measured. He declared the petition for guardianship denied, citing the overwhelming evidence of my competence and the disturbing attempt at fraud committed by those who should have been my protectors. He ordered an investigation into the forged documents and reminded the court that family bonds are sacred and not to be exploited for greed. The gavel fell one last time, and the sound carried not just through the courtroom, but through the hollow space Eldon and Marjorie had carved with their treachery. As I rose from the stand, relief surged through me, mingled with sorrow for what had been lost. Eldon would not meet my eyes, his face pale with fury and humiliation. Marjorie clung to his arm, her facade shattered, her tears now real but rooted in fear rather than love. Darla embraced me tightly, whispering that the truth had won, that I had won, and I allowed myself the smallest smile. The courthouse emptied, and the crowd outside buzzed with talk of betrayal and justice. Yet for me, the battle was more than a legal victory. It was a reclaiming of my dignity, my independence, my life. Darla shielded me from the chaos, guiding me to her car, but not before I caught sight of Eldon storming down the steps, Marjorie gripping his arm so tightly her knuckles whitened. Their faces were masks of humiliation and rage, and though they avoided my gaze, I felt the weight of their hatred pressing heavily in the air between us. That night, the house felt different, quieter, but no longer suffocating. The shadows that had once seemed to watch me now retreated into corners, harmless and empty. I walked through each room deliberately, running my fingers along the wooden frames, the shelves stacked with memories, the photographs that had survived decades. My father's clock still ticked steadily on the mantel, and I let its rhythm remind me that life moves forward no matter how many try to seize control of it. Darla insisted on staying with me for the first night, and while I told her I was fine, I welcomed the company. We sat together at the kitchen table, drinking coffee in silence until she finally said that the community would be buzzing for weeks. I nodded, knowing whispers would carry far, that betrayal within a family always traveled faster than truth, but I no longer feared the judgment. The next morning, a letter slipped under my door reminded me that Eldon and Marjorie were not finished. It was scrawled hastily, unsigned but obvious, filled with venomous words calling me ungrateful, accusing me of ruining their lives, promising that I would regret turning them into criminals in the eyes of the world. I read it calmly, folded it neatly, and placed it in a drawer. I knew better than to engage with threats dressed as pleas. Instead, I phoned Sylvia and informed her, and she advised me to keep every letter, every attempt at intimidation as evidence. Her tone was steady, but carried the weight of experience, the knowledge that those who lose power rarely accept defeat with grace. As days passed, the town revealed its divided heart. Old neighbors approached me with soft words of support, pressing my hand, telling me they always believed I was sharp and capable. Others crossed the street when they saw me, unwilling to be caught between loyalties, fearful of Eldon's anger or Marjorie's sharp tongue. At church, the stares lingered longer than the hymns, but Reverend Harris placed a hand on my shoulder and reminded me that truth shines longest, even when clouds gather. His words steadied me. though the ache of betrayal remained. Nights were hardest when the stillness amplified every memory of Eldon as a boy, his laughter in the backyard, the way he used to run to me with scraped knees and trust in his eyes. That boy was gone, replaced by a man blinded by greed, and I wrestled with grief for someone still alive. Eldon tried one last time to twist the story. An article appeared in the local paper, his words painting him as a devoted son victimized by a bitter old man swayed by outsiders. He claimed the court had been manipulated, that lies had poisoned the judge against him. Yet the editor allowed Sylvia to publish a rebuttal, outlining the evidence and the forgery. The public, hungry for drama, consumed both versions, but the tide had already turned. The realtor's testimony, the forged documents, and the very presence of Darla and Sylvia by my side had exposed enough truth that Eldon's narrative fell flat. I heard whispers in the diner, saw heads shake when his name was mentioned, and though the shame did not stop him, it isolated him. Marjorie grew quieter, less visible in public, her bravado crumbling under the weight of exposure. One evening, as the sky bruised purple with dusk, I found Eldon waiting at the edge of my property. His figure was tense, his jaw set, his eyes burning with a mixture of rage and desperation. He shouted that I had destroyed him, that I had chosen strangers over my own blood, that no father would do such a thing. I listened, letting him spit his venom, and when he paused for breath, I told him calmly that I had not destroyed him. He had destroyed himself. I reminded him of every choice he had made, every lie he had told, every signature he had tried to forge, and I told him that while I still loved the boy he once was, I could no longer stand by the man he had become. My words seemed to strike deeper than any gavel, and for a moment I saw his fury falter, replaced by something almost like sorrow. But then he turned, muttering curses, and disappeared into the night, leaving me with a silence heavier than his presence. The weeks that followed brought inquiries from the district attorney's office, quiet phone calls asking for my cooperation as they built a case on the forged documents. I knew the law would take its course, and though part of me longed for reconciliation, I also knew accountability mattered more. Darla remained close, her visits brightening the house, and Sylvia checked in often, reminding me that survival was not enough, that I had to live fully. Slowly, I began to reclaim routines, tending to the garden, repairing a fence, even hosting a Sunday dinner for the first time in months. The laughter that filled the house that evening was different from Eldon's childhood laughter, but it was healing, genuine, born of trust rather than manipulation. The seasons shifted quickly after the chaos, summer yielding to crisp autumn, the air sharpened with the scent of fallen leaves and wood smoke. Life outside seemed ordinary again, children running along sidewalks, shopkeepers preparing for harvest festivals, neighbors raking their yards. Yet within me, nothing felt ordinary. I carried the scars of betrayal like invisible ink written across my chest, but I also carried a kind of quiet strength that had been forged in fire. The trial, the public humiliation, the venomous threats, and the painful confrontation with Eldon had left their mark. But rather than breaking me, they had hardened me into someone who understood his own worth, someone who would not be easily silenced or erased. The nights were long at first, each shadow reminding me of the face of my son, the fury in his eyes as he shouted across my property line. I would stand at the window and wonder if he regretted anything, if he lay awake haunted by the choices that had stripped him of trust, reputation, and family. Yet as weeks passed and no more letters arrived, no more confrontations erupted, I realized that Eldon had finally receded into the distance, consumed by the life he had chosen. Marjorie was gone from town, her presence erased like chalk from a blackboard, whispers claiming she had left for her sister's house in another state. I did not chase after them, nor did I hold any illusions of reconciliation. Instead, I accepted what remained, a house filled with memories, a life not stolen but reclaimed, and the unshakable truth that love cannot excuse betrayal when betrayal turns cruel. One Sunday morning, I hosted another dinner. The table stretched with food, steam rising from dishes prepared with the kind of care I had almost forgotten how to give. Darla sat at my side, her laughter like a bell ringing through the room, and Sylvia brought a bottle of wine, raising a glass to new beginnings. The guests who gathered were not my blood, but they were family in spirit, bound by loyalty and kindness rather than obligation. I realized then that family is not always who shares your name or your house, but who chooses to stand with you when the world crumbles. Eldon had chosen greed, Marjorie had chosen deception, but Darla and Sylvia had chosen truth, and that choice mattered more than the ties of blood. Later that night, as the dishes dried and the last of the guests departed, I stepped onto the porch. The moon hung low, silvering the fields, and the old clock inside ticked steadily, its rhythm a heartbeat of continuity. I breathed deeply, tasting the cool night air. I let myself reflect on all that had passed. Betrayal hurts most when it comes from those you raised, those you once carried on your shoulders, those you once believed would honor the foundation you built for them. But the lesson carved deep into me was that survival does not depend on the loyalty of others. Survival is born in the refusal to let others define your worth, in the strength to stand even when those closest try to tear you down. I thought of Eldon's childhood again, of the scraped knees and laughter, of the moments that had once convinced me he would grow into a man of integrity. That dream had crumbled, and though part of me mourned, another part finally released it. Holding on to that image only tethered me to pain, and I deserved better than to live in chains of memory. I whispered a farewell into the night, not for Eldon the man who had betrayed me, but for the boy who had once brought me joy. It was a farewell that freed me, a final release that allowed me to step forward without carrying his shadow. The town, too, began to shift. Where once stares lingered, nods of respect replaced them. Where whispers had carried scandal, people now spoke of resilience. The truth had settled, firm as stone, and with time, the ripples of scandal faded. No one could erase what Eldon and Marjorie had done, but neither could they erase how I had endured, how I had chosen dignity over silence, justice over fear. That legacy mattered more than the gossip that had once threatened to drown me. Winter arrived, snow falling softly across the roof, the garden buried beneath white silence. I rose each morning with purpose, whether to tend to small chores, to write letters to old friends, or to welcome visitors who brought warmth into the house. Darla remained a steady presence, her visits a reminder that companionship need not fade with age. Sylvia continued to advise me, her voice a calm anchor. And I, once dismissed as frail and easily manipulated, now stood as a man who had survived deceit and reclaimed his autonomy. The final test of any life is not in avoiding pain, but in learning from it. My pain had been sharp, carved by betrayal that cut through blood ties, but had taught me lessons no book could offer. I learned that trust is sacred and must be guarded. I learned that age does not weaken a man's mind, only the doubt others try to force upon it. I learned that standing firm in truth may cost you relationships, but it gives you peace. And above all, I learned that respect is not given freely, even within a family. It must be earned and protected. As I sat by the fire one evening, the flames dancing against the logs, I realized the house no longer felt haunted. It felt alive, not with ghosts of betrayal, but with the resilience that filled its walls. I was not broken, not diminished, but renewed. The clock struck gently, marking the hours, and I closed my eyes with gratitude. Gratitude that I had survived. Gratitude that I had stood firm. Gratitude that the story did not end in despair, but in strength. The end. When I finish a story like this, I always wonder how it reaches the people who listen to it. If you've followed me through every stage, you've walked with me from the first moment of doubt to the final moment of strength, and that journey means more when it's shared. If you felt the weight of betrayal and the meaning of survival in what I told, let me know. Tell me in the comments what part of the plot hit you hardest and where you're watching from, because I want to hear how these lessons live beyond my own walls. Your voice makes this story bigger than just mine. And if you want me to keep bringing stories that carry both pain and hope, show your support by liking this video and subscribing. That way, you don't just witness the story, you become part of it.